Did you know that we once had a war with Spain? Well, we did, and that's what you're going to learn about today in our 2.2 notes, the Spanish-American War. So, I really don't like to give notes on a Friday, so to avoid doing that, even though I'm out on a Thursday, we are going to do notes like this. So, make sure that you are taking down these notes in your packet, just like you would off the board, and let's get started. So before we move on, we need to go back and briefly touch on part 1, which was imperialism and America, looking at those motives of imperialism. So on your notes review, it says, why did the United States seek to build an empire in the late 1800s, early 1900s? List and explain an economic, military, and cultural reason. So let's go back and look at those reasons. Okay, so economic was our big one, and it has to do with the Industrial Revolution. So we talked about that we were overproducing goods and we needed raw materials to produce more goods. Colonies were able to meet both of those needs. Okay, we could sell the overproduced goods to colonial peoples and we could get the materials from the colonies. Okay, so that way it solved some of those problems of economic depression. The major military reason is wanting to compete with those other nations. Wanting to compete with those other nations that we talked about were already establishing worldwide empires. And so what we see as a direct result of this is the construction of our big navy, and we become the third largest naval power in the world. And then that cultural reason is kind of half this social Darwinism and white supremacy, thinking that if we can take it, then it's ours to take. And then half this idea of, oh, those poor people in the colonies, we need to make them just like us because we're awesome, right? So kind of that attitude. And both of those are used to justify some of the evils of imperialism. Okay, so we have our economic reason based on the Industrial Revolution, our military reason based on wanting to compete on that worldwide stage, and then our cultural reason of if we can take it, we should take it, and that it's our duty to go and help, putting help in quotes, these other peoples. Okay, so moving on from there to what we need to look at now, which is the Spanish-American War. So we're going to talk about why a Spanish-American War starts in the first place. We're going to look at what happens in the course of that war and then the aftermath of that war. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the first thing we need to look at is this Cuban rebellion against Spain, okay? So the first part of the Spanish-American War doesn't even involve us yet, okay? It involves an empire conflict with Spain. So Spain, once upon a time, was the most powerful empire in the world. Okay, you can see on this map on the left the empire that Spain had in Latin America all the way to the year 1800. Okay, they were the top dogs worldwide. Okay, but Spain is kind of like that guy that gets really tall and muscular in like 6th grade, and so all the girls love him, but by the time his senior year portraits come around, he's like already going bald. Okay, like peaked too early. That's kind of what happens with Spain. Okay, so we see here this exact same map, but by 1830, Spain has lost pretty much everything on this map that they once had. Okay, by 1830, Spain only has Cuba and Puerto Rico, which are here in the Caribbean, and then Guam and the Philippines, which are in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so as everybody else is really starting to begin their campaigns of imperialism, Spain's is declining. Okay, so why are we involved in this at all? Okay, well, one of those imperial possessions of Spain was Cuba. Cuba is about 90 miles to the south of the southern tip of Florida. Like, you can actually swim super far. Like, if you're an Olympic swimmer, you can swim from Florida to Cuba. I wouldn't suggest trying it. But we had an interest in Cuba. We had an economic and military interest. So we actually wanted to buy Cuba. We offered to pay Spain a very large sum of money to purchase Cuba, and the Spanish foreign minister responded that he would rather see Cuba sink into the ocean than have us purchase it. So kind of tells you how he felt about that. But that didn't stop us from investing there. So just because we couldn't control it politically doesn't mean that we weren't going to have economic influence, okay? And so what we see are lots of U.S. investors buying up land in Cuba and beginning to have sugar plantations, okay? Sugar grows really well in Cuba, and you could make a lot of money off of that, okay? So you have the establishment of these U.S. sugar plantation investments in Cuba. Okay, so where does war come into all of it, okay? This is going to be the second war for Cuban independence. So as you can tell from the title, this was not their first go-round with trying to rebel from Spain, because it's the second Cuban war for independence. They had been crushed the first time, and the second time they were determined to win and get their independence. So a poet named Jose Marti launched a revolution against Spain for the independence of Cuba in 1895. Now, where do we come in? Okay, he started to target those U.S. sugar plantations to try to get our attention. Okay, so he's going around burning sugar crops, destroying windmills, basically trying to get us to pay attention to what's going on there. Okay, and the response from the U.S. public is split. Okay, some people want us to be on the side of Spain to protect these investments. Like, hey, what is this poet going around and destroying our stuff? We need to do what we can to stop him. But other people sympathized with Cuba, and they said, you know what? Free Cuba, Cuba Libre, sounds a whole lot like give me liberty or give me death. Okay, and you can even see in this political cartoon here, Uncle Sam like using the flag to protect Cuba from the Spanish. Okay, so there's kind of this attitude of, hey, this cry for independence kind of sounds familiar. Okay, so keeping that in mind, we need to look at what happens next. All right, so we know that we will eventually enter into this war, but there's going to be some steps to our entry. Okay, and the first thing is going to be Spain retaliating to this revolution in Cuba. Okay, so Spain sent a military man named General Weyler to go crush the rebellion, and he was going to do whatever he had to do to crush it. Okay, he was very cruel to the point that people called him Butcher Weyler. Okay, he was known for rounding people up in concentration camps with no shelter, and you know, if you've ever been down to the Caribbean, you know that it's going to get pretty hot pretty quick. Okay, and so that was kind of his trademark, was that anyone that was rebelling, he would put them in a concentration camp. And so this is going to spark back in the U.S. a headline war. Okay, this is the golden age of what was called the penny press. It was really cheap to produce newspapers, and reading the newspaper was kind of like a national pastime. Okay, remember there's not a whole lot else to do at this point. And you had Pulitzer and Hearst, who owned the two biggest newspapers, and they were in this war with one another, so to speak, seeing who could sell more newspapers. Okay, and in the same way today that websites try to make money by having clickbait headlines, okay, because for every click they get paid by their advertisers, Hearst and Pulitzer wanted to have as many people as they could buy their newspapers. And so they had these very overblown, exaggerated, sometimes outright false headlines and articles. Okay, and that's called yellow journalism. And we're going to talk about that when we get to your current event. But this is basically the original fake news. Okay, and so this really played up the atrocities of General Weyler. So one example of this yellow journalism is this famous exchange here to the left. So Remington was a photographer that Hearst, who owned a newspaper, sent down to Cuba to take pictures of the coming war. Okay, Remington telegraphed Hearst and said, everything is quiet, there is no trouble here, there will be no war, I wish to return. So basically saying like, dude, why do you have me down here? There's nothing even to photograph. And Hearst responded, please remain, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. So basically, if you can, drum me up a picture of something, we're going to drum up enough public opinion to where we'll have a war. Okay, and so you already have this outrage among the American public of all of these things that they're reading about Butcher Weiler doing to the Cuban rebels. Okay, so that's already got war fever beginning to escalate, and then it's going to escalate even more with what's called the Delhomme letter. Okay, so as Remington said, it looked like this problem was getting solved. Okay, so McKinley had stepped in at this point, he's our president, and was solving all of this diplomatically. Like, it didn't look like it was going to have to come to war. Spain and Cuba were going to settle their differences without us having to fight a war. Okay, but we intercept a letter from the Spanish minister to the people in Cuba representing Spain, okay? And it criticized McKinley. It said that he was a low politician, weak, and catering to the rabble. So basically that he just did whatever people told him to do, that he couldn't stand up for himself, okay? And believe it or not, 100 years ago, people were really scandalized when you made fun of the president, okay, or criticized the president in any way. It's almost kind of like how it's all fun and games if you want to tell jokes about your own family, but then once somebody else does, it's like fighting words. Okay, it was kind of the same thing. Like, hey, we can criticize our own president, but you people from another country, get out of here with that criticism. Okay, so this is just going to further outrage the public and really is going to do away with any chance of solving it diplomatically because the U.S. public is now very angry and wants war. So the straw that will break the camel's back, so to speak, is the explosion of the USS Maine. So the USS Maine was a large battleship that had been sent down to Havana Harbor to protect the U.S. citizens that were living in Havana and to protect U.S. investments. Okay, like we said, there was a lot of money invested in Cuba and it was getting destroyed in this second war for independence. Well, one night, the USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor and kills 260 Americans. Okay, now we don't really know exactly what happened with the USS Maine. More modern, like archaeological dives down into Havana Harbor have turned up evidence that it was probably just an onboard explosion, like just a really unfortunate accident. Okay, but the newspapers with no factual evidence whatsoever are going to blame Spain. Okay, so we see some examples of headlines here. Bloodthirsty Spaniards blow up United States man-of-war Maine in Havana Harbor, destroyed by a torpedo. Okay, so there was no evidence of a torpedo whatsoever, but remember, yellow journalism, the original fake news, they're just trying to sell as many newspapers as they can. Okay, again, we see here Spanish treachery. Okay, this photograph right here was printed over and over again. Okay, obviously kind of tugs at your heartstrings to think of 260 people dying. Okay, and so at this point, the public is just like out for blood against Spain. Okay, the battle cry became "To hell with Spain, remember the Maine." All right, kind of like the original meme. So war is at this point going to erupt between Spain and the United States. So McKinley can no longer ignore this public outcry against Spain, and even though Spain actually pretty much surrenders to us, says like, look, we're not trying to have a war, let's solve this, the U.S. public wants war to such a degree that it really can't be ignored anymore, okay? And so Congress declares war on Spain on April 20th, 1898. Okay, so we are now in the Spanish-American War. So what happens in the Spanish-American War? Oddly enough, the first battle of the Spanish-American War will be in neither Spain nor America. It will be in the Philippines, okay? The Philippines are a chain of islands in the Pacific, sort of off the coast of Southeast Asia. And George Dewey, who was one of our Navy admirals, leads a surprise attack against the Spanish port at the Philippines and sinks the entire Spanish fleet that was stationed at Manila. So Manila was the capital of the Philippines, and then we invaded the mainland of the Philippines and met up with Filipino rebels. Okay, so there was actually already a revolution taking place of the Filipinos against the Spanish, and so we sort of like team up with them to fight the Spanish as part of our war. Okay, remember that because it's going to be important later. Okay, also worth noting, I did not misspell Filipino. The original native language of the Philippines spells it with an F. And so when you're describing the group of people from the Philippines, we still use the F instead of the PH out of courtesy to that native language. Anyways, in the Caribbean is where we have our next big showdown. Okay, so this is where Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders make their famous charge up San Juan Hill in Cuba. It actually wasn't San Juan Hill. It was a hill right next to San Juan Hill, but again, remember that this is all the original fake news. We also fight a successful naval battle off the coast of Puerto Rico and invade Puerto Rico. And so at this point, we have now taken over 3 out of 4 of Spain's imperial possessions. Okay, we have Puerto Rico, we have Cuba, we have the Philippines, and really no one cares about Guam. Okay, so 75% of Spain's empire is under our control, and that's the percent that matters. So at this point, Spain asks for an armistice and peace. Which brings us then to the peace treaty, which is called the Treaty of Paris. This is the Treaty of Paris of 1898. It's important to note that date because there's about 8 billion treaties of Paris throughout history, and we want to make sure that we're talking about the correct one. So in the terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1898, Spain agrees to free Cuba. Spain also gives Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States. And then the United States buys the Philippines from Spain. Okay, again, that's going to be important here in a minute. The outcome of this treaty back in the United States is that there's some debate about the morality of this treaty. Okay, is it right to use warfare to take over another country? Is it right to take over a country that had been in the midst of its own rebellion against an imperial power? Some people brought up, hey, aren't we just going to replace Spain as the imperial power over these people? Like, what did they actually fight for? Because they're not getting their independence. There's also some debate over the economics of absorbing territories into our empire. Are these people going to become U.S. citizens? Are they going to be able to freely immigrate to the U.S.? Okay, so there's some unanswered questions about both of those issues, but ultimately the Senate does approve this treaty, and this is really how the U.S. gets its first empire, okay? And let's look at what happens now with that empire. Okay, so Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is going to remain under U.S. military control until 1900. So remember that we had invaded Puerto Rico and our troops were still there occupying it. Okay, so what was going to happen next? Okay, we have the Foraker Act in 1900, which sets up a civilian government in Puerto Rico. But there are some restrictions. So the Supreme Court rules that the people of Puerto Rico and really anybody that's in our empire doesn't automatically get the protections of the Constitution. So like 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment doesn't necessarily extend to people in territories. Also under the Foraker Act, the Puerto Ricans could only vote for their House of Representatives. All of their senators and their governor were appointed. They do gain more self-rule over time. So Congress grants them citizenship in 1917. That's really important to know for this unit, but also just like for your general knowledge of current events. Okay, that when things happen in Puerto Rico, like those are U.S. citizens in the same way that a person born on the mainland U.S. is a citizen. So all of the protections of the Constitution and everything do now apply to anyone that's born in Puerto Rico. Okay, they're a U.S. citizen just like I'm a U.S. citizen. And then they also do later get the right to elect their legislature. Puerto Rico today has had a couple opportunities to vote for either statehood or independence, but they have voted to be a commonwealth, okay? So they're sort of this kind of halfway thing between a state and between their own country. They do pay federal taxes and they do get federal money, to support their different things that tax dollars support. They are allowed to have a primary for the Democratic and Republican parties, but they are not allowed to vote in the general election for president. Okay, so they're kind of like this halfway thing between a state and another country, and that's maybe a situation to keep an eye on as things continue to develop in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. So now looking at Cuba. So Cuba from the Treaty of Paris is officially independent, okay? That was part of the treaty, was that Spain granted Cuba its independence. Remember that that's where we started with this whole thing, was the Second Cuban War for Independence, all right? But U.S. soldiers are still occupying Cuba, so we still have a military presence there. And anyone who is rebelling against that military presence is being rounded up and put in a concentration camp, just like what General Weyler had done. Okay, so that doesn't really sound very independent to me, right? Like if you live in a country, but someone else's military is in charge and you're not allowed to speak out against that military, that really doesn't sound much like independence. Okay, so we will see ourselves kind of become the villain in some of these stories. Now, we do modernize Cuba in a lot of ways and bring some order to it. It had very much been a developing nation, and we help turn it into a more developed nation than it was before. For example, we build a lot of roads and telegraph lines. We also help cure some of their diseases that were more endemic to like the mosquito swamp kind of areas. But we need to look here at the Platt Amendment. So this is a big part of the ongoing relationship from here on between the U.S. and Cuba. So the Platt Amendment is an amendment that the United States forced Cuba to add to their new constitution. So again, that doesn't really sound like independence to me. If when you're writing your constitution, another country gets to force you to put things in it, how independent are you really? Okay, so in the Platt Amendment, you can see here on this chart, Cuba becomes an American protectorate, okay? And that's kind of like a little brother that we get to make some decisions for, okay? The U.S. military would rule in Cuba for a while. We could intervene in certain economic and military and political affairs of Cuba if we felt like it was necessary for us to intervene to protect our interests. Okay, we also get to have a naval base on the island of Cuba, and that's what Guantanamo Bay is. Okay, Guantanamo Bay, which you'll sometimes hear called Gitmo, that is where a lot of terrorists and terror suspects are held, and they do not receive constitutional protection there because it's not actually in the United States. And so that's kind of an ongoing controversy that has really picked up in recent years. So we will continue to have involvement in Cuba really all the way up until the 1950s, until Cuba has a communist revolution because of its strategic involvement. If you look here at this map, Cuba is kind of like the gatekeeper country to the Gulf of Mexico as a whole. Okay, so that's a very strategic location militarily, and then also to protect those U.S. business interests, those sugar plantations that we already mentioned. Okay, so remember when I kept saying, remember what we're doing to the Philippines because that will be important later. Here we go with the Philippines, okay? So in the Philippines, the Treaty of Paris is going to spark outrage, okay? The Filipinos believed that by virtue of fighting alongside us in the Spanish-American War, that they would get independence. Okay, so remember, they had already started an independence movement, and we sort of like joined up with them. Okay, and so they believed that when we defeated Spain, they would get their independence from Spain. And they did get their independence from Spain, but then we just replaced Spain. Okay, so they still are not independent. They just trade out one imperialist ruling country for another. Okay, so not surprisingly, we end up with a revolt in the Philippines against U.S. control. It's led by a leader named Emilio Aguinaldo, and it's going to become the Philippine-American War. So 2 wars today that you probably didn't even know we had. Okay, so what's really sad about this is that we actually end up using some of the exact same tactics that Spain had used in Cuba that everybody had gotten so mad about. Okay, specifically what is called at this time the water cure, but what will later be known as waterboarding. This was a quote: "His sufferings must be that of a man who is drowning but cannot drown." Okay, and that was an observation of a lieutenant in the U.S. military who watched someone be waterboarded, which is a type of torture. So it actually takes 3 years to put this rebellion down. Okay, it only takes like a couple months to fight the Spanish-American War. In fact, some people called it a splendid little war. And then here we are 3 years to fight the Philippine-American War. It cost 4,000 U.S. lives, 20,000 Filipino lives, and 400 million U.S. dollars. Okay, so this almost kind of like spin-off war, sequel war, you could think of it, is actually going to be a way bigger mess than the original war of the Spanish-American. So the aftermath of the Philippine-American War is that the United States establishes a similar government in the Philippines as we did in Puerto Rico, where there's some military control, but they do begin to move gradually toward independence, and the Philippines will become an independent republic on July the 4th, 1946. The Philippines are going to play a really big role in World War II. Okay, so all of this, as far as us keeping the Philippines as part of our empire, is going to be extremely important down the road. All right, so here we see the outcome of the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War. Okay, and this basically is that the United States now has an empire. Okay, so Cuba is a protectorate, Puerto Rico and Guam are a territory, and the Philippines are also a territory. All right, so that is it for our notes, but we do have a think about it today, and I want you to do this, and we're going to talk about it when I get back tomorrow, okay? So for your think about it today, we have a political cartoon, and it's called "Well, I Hardly Know Which to Take First." It was published in May of 1898 in the Boston Globe. Okay, so looking at who does the waiter represent, so here's our waiter. You can find his name on the towel over his arm right here. And then who does the customer represent? So here is our mascot guy, right? So what is he supposed to represent? The next question is going to ask you about the bill of fare. Okay, so that's here in the middle of the cartoon, middle of the top, where it says bill of fare. And a bill of fare is similar to a menu. It's kind of another word from for menu. And so it's asking you what items are on this bill of fare or this menu. Okay, so you've got a couple different items here. It's asking you what does this bill of fare represent overall? Okay, so what is all of this supposed to mean? And then looking at the title, what do you think the cartoonist is trying to say with the title of the cartoon? That title being, "Well, I Hardly Know Which to Take First." And then what is the overall message of this cartoon? Okay, as far as, is this in favor of what we did in the Spanish-American War? Is it against it? Is it just making an observation? And if it's just making an observation, what is that observation? Okay, so what is the overall message here? Okay, I'm going to leave that up on the screen for a little bit longer just to give you a chance to answer those questions. You do need to answer them on your Think About It page, and be prepared to go over that when I come back tomorrow. Once you finish that, you need to get your phone, which you probably already have, but you need to get your phone and work on your comp check. Okay, so we do have a comp check for today. All right, guys, I'm going to be quiet now and just let it play for a few more minutes for you to finish working on this Think About It, and then all you have to do besides that is your comp check, and I hope that y'all have a great rest of your day.